Wow. This was a good one. I don't know what it was about From Russia with Love, but it just followed a little too close to the movie, and a lot like the movie that came after this book. There's not a whole lot of action, it's just a lot of talking. It's slow, but I will admit it did keep my interest to some capacity. Goldfinger, on the other hand, was a completely different story. I'd put this one up with Moonraker. A lot of excitement, a very strange and interesting villain, a fun and evil plan to follow around with, and epic car chase. Well, I will admit that the story is pretty similar to the movie. There are just enough differences in it to make it worthwhile. We start at the very beginning, where Bond just came back from a rather dubious assignment of assassinating a Mexican drug lord known as Capongo. Kind of similar to how it's done in the movie. The major difference is, as he's waiting in Miami for his flight to come to him, he kind of reflects on this poor guy that he just killed. The idea that life is such a fragile state, can be easily taken away. The idea that Capongo was a big, buff guy, but yet all it took was one shot and he was gone forever. While he's waiting for his flight schedule to get back to England, he runs into an old face, a Mr. DuPont. Which, if you remember correctly, in Casino Royale there were three major players at the table. You had the Chief, you had Bond, and this third guy known as Mr. DuPont. Mr. DuPont knows that Bond is involved in law enforcement of some kind, and wonders if he can help him out. Since Bond is just kind of stuck there and waiting for his flight the next day, he figures he'd go for it. So that night, he's treated like the guest of royalty, taken to the best restaurants, given the best champagne, given the best crab legs. You could just tell it's a very warm and loving scene. And during this lavish dinner, Mr. DuPont explains his story. He's been playing two-hand canasta with a rather mysterious figure known as Goldfinger. He is quite convinced that he is cheating, as he's lost $20,000 to him. Now, I don't know much about canasta, but the way it's described in the book, wins and losses are about 50-50, but the idea to lose that much money seems a bit more than coincidence. The next day, Bond scopes out the situation. He meets face to face with this mysterious Auric Goldfinger. He is described strangely in this book. He almost seems like an amalgamation of Frankenstein's monster, how no two pieces of his body seem to have come from the same person. He also has a really deep sunburn and red hair. I guess Ian Fleming didn't really like redheads that much, as Hugo Drax was also a redhead. So just like in the movie, it turns out that Mr. Goldfinger is in fact cheating at cards. Essentially his secretary, Jill Masterton. So here's just a bit of a side note. So in the movie it's Masterson, in the book it's Masterton. I have a feeling somewhere in this review I'm going to accidentally call her Masterson when I really mean Masterton. With that, let's continue. So, just like in the movie, she is clad in a bikini, staring at Mr. DuPont's cards and giving Goldfinger the best instructions to win the game. So, just like in the movie, Bond puts a stop to this and requests that Goldfinger just signs a check for the $20,000 and leave it at that. And as a way to seal the deal, he is also taking Jill along with him. However, after a little bit of back and forth, Goldfinger just kind of shrugs off the idea and requests that Jill comes back to work for him at the same pay and for the same amount of time as before. Seeing that there was no will, Jill goes right back to him, while Bond makes his way back to MI6 in London. There he is given a briefing by M on a suspected gold smuggler. This is part of a different department, more of the Bank of England than MI6. So Bond is sent over to a Colonel Smithers to go over the idea of why Goldfinger is a prime suspect, as well as how he may or may not be smuggling this gold out of the country. So in that letter where Goldfinger asks Jill to come back to work, he also offers Bond a friendly game of golf. So in order to try to keep close tabs on him, Bond takes him up on that offer. Now there's a little bit of character development here. Apparently Bond was quite an avid golfer 20 years ago, and he's only now just kind of getting back into the sport. In fact, a few people from the club actually still recognize him. So he gets in a few practice swings, and he still got it. Goldfinger comes up at his usual time, and they have a game. Unlike the movie where the bet is a bar of gold, it's the $20,000 that Goldfinger lost in that game of canasta. I have to admit, this is where I got some Atlas Shrugged flashbacks. So I've kind of complained about the idea that the John Galt speech goes on for like a good 30 pages. It's boring, and it would also probably be far more interesting to see somebody do that in real life. The golf game between Bond and Goldfinger is very much the same way. It goes on for a very long time, it's very slow and boring, and I have a feeling it would be far more entertaining to just watch two people bat around a ball for the next... Well, let's see, there was 18 holes, and about 8 of them are thoroughly described. At least the movie was able to cut it down to maybe like 1.5. And even then, I feel like they found a way to also keep it thrilling. So it's very obvious that Goldfinger is trying to cheat Bond, but Bond gets back at him and cheats Goldfinger. He ends up winning the game, but Goldfinger seems to be a really good sport about this. He even offers him to dinner at his mansion. This is where things start to get a little interesting. At his mansion, Goldfinger introduced Bond to his henchman, known as Oddjobs. That's kind of his little sense of humor. He calls them Oddjobs because that's exactly what he uses them for. All the odd jobs of his enterprises. Now, the way they describe him here, he basically sounds like an immovable tank, which I think is pretty well portrayed on the screen. But the interesting thing is they show Oddjobs' ability to just completely wreck furniture, being able to do high kicks twice his normal size, and not even a wince of pain. And it's also interesting to note that the iconic bowler hat, that was actually borrowed from the book. Which, I guess after Dr. No, how crazy it was with the endurance test as well as the fight against the giant squid, the bowler hat is probably the most out there thing in this one. There's a little bit of background there. Oddjobs, as well as most of Goldfinger's employees, are Korean. The main reason for this is that they work really well for him, they work cheaply, and he's the only one that can understand them, so there is no way they can be betrayed by an outside company. And Oddjobs is obviously the top of the line. Before dinner happens, Goldfinger and Oddjob have to go out for a little bit to take care of some problems with the plant. So Bond decides to do a little snooping around. Doesn't really find a whole lot when all of a sudden he notices this clicking sound off in the distance. He looks really closely and he finds that it's a camera that's been recording his every move. For some odd reason, there is a cat roaming the halls. Essentially, he tries to pin it all on the cat as to why the phone got destroyed. It's a flimsy excuse, but it's something to work on. Goldfinger comes back with Oddjobs, and before they get started with dinner, Goldfinger tries to take a look at the footage. However, seeing that it's been destroyed by the cat, once again, I don't really know why there's a cat there, he gets quite angry at the cat and then gives it the Oddjobs for his dinner. You really got to know the time period that this book came out in. After the very lovely dinner, Goldfinger leaves Bond a very cryptic message that he should stay close to him. Bond isn't really sure how to respond to this, but he figures that he should keep a close eye on Goldfinger anyway. So he puts a tracker on his favorite car. He follows him all the way to Switzerland. And I'll have to admit, I found these chapters really riveting. Maybe it's because I've gone on road trips where I've never had instructions and can only follow people, but I find myself really relating to this. The idea that you have to kind of half predict which way he's going to go. Okay, so he's going to go to the right. Oh no, he's going to the left. I got to figure out how to turn around. I don't know any of these roads. It's thrilling, but at the same time, it's also a little bit of fun. During the pursuit, seems to be another person interested in Goldfinger's actions. A random woman, which Bond doesn't really recognize. As a way to try to get rid of her, he rear-ends her and then attempts to leave her with the broken car. However, she is a woman of action and refuses to take such treatment from a man. So she firmly requests that he takes her to her destination, which is a hotel just a few miles up the road. It's kind of a coincidence that it turns out that this hotel is exactly where Bond wants to be. It's in the range of the trackers, so Bond can still keep an eye on Goldfinger. The next day, Goldfinger takes this mysterious package and shoves it under a bridge. Bond unwraps it to find that it is a bar of gold. This is enough to confirm his suspicions that he is an agent of SMERSH and that he's using his gold to fund terrorist operations all over the world. The tracking goes on, and Bond tracks Goldfinger to his factory. There at the factory, Bond runs into this mysterious woman again. It turns out that this is Tilly Masterson, Jill's sister. As it turns out, Goldfinger has a bit of a fetish. Essentially what he likes to do is, about once a month, he takes a random woman off the streets, pays her a lot of money to be painted head to toe in gold paint, and then attempts to have sex with her. This man is so obsessed with gold, he even wants to make love to it. However, this time was different. Usually when it comes to this paint, there is like a small little patch of skin that is not painted in order to prevent skin suffocation, which apparently is a real thing. After the canasta fiasco, Goldfinger took his revenge out on Jill Masterton and painted her entire body gold. She died a few days later, but before she passed, she gave her sister a ring that she wanted Bond to have for saving her, so to speak. Quite rightly, Tilly is out to try to kill Goldfinger, but Bond wants to keep him alive in order to bring him to justice. So there is a bit of a scuffle there, and that is where Tilly relates the story that I just said before. So just as she's about to give him the gold ring, a silver arrow goes right through it and knocks it against the tree. There we see Odd Jobs. Rather interesting choice. And they are immediately captured by a squad of Korean soldiers. When Bond wakes up, he's in a pretty similar contraption to what they have in the movie. However, instead of a laser beam, there is a saw blade going up the crotch. But the interesting thing is, the means of torture this time is Odd Jobs. I guess he knows something about the chakra structure, so he knows exactly the right places to hit to cause the most pain, but not to damage anything important to the body, like muscles or bones. So Goldfinger is trying to get some information out of Bond. Why is he there at the factory, and how much does his employer know? In fact, who even is his employer? Doesn't work. Bond is severely tortured, but the only information that he gives to Goldfinger is one last plea. A chance for employment. Both him and the girl, which she's still alive, unlike in the movie, would work for Goldfinger. It doesn't seem to go anywhere, so by sheer willpower he holds his breath long enough to black out. When he comes to, he finds himself on board an airplane headed for New York City. Once they land, Goldfinger explains the score. Essentially, he needs all the staff possible as he's going to pull off a gigantic heist known as Operation Grand Slam. He needs him as well as Tilly to do secretarial work. However, it's mostly Bond doing it. Tilly just kind of hands out the sheets while he's the one doing all the stenographing and everything else. So what is Operation Grand Slam? It's essentially Goldfinger's great scheme to rob Fort Knox. Now, like I said, Goldfinger needs every available hand in order to pull this off successfully. So he rounds up all of the greatest mobsters throughout the United States and meets them together and proposes his plan for Operation Grand Slam. Now, what's rather interesting is how they describe some of these people. A few of them are quite nightmarish. There was one guy that had a nervous tic where his right eye would blink at the same pace as his heart, so you could tell if he was running really nervous. Another had his lower lip cut off, so he permanently had the Joker smile thing going. And he was also unable to pronounce certain letters. And then there's some that just kind of had eyes that could, turn you to stone. But probably one of the more interesting ones they have is Pussy Galore. Now, it's interesting that in this book, she just is another mobster like all these other people. However, in the movie, she is Goldfinger's personal pilot. Now, as the name would suggest, she runs a gang of lesbians, herself also a lesbian, and they run pretty good business, just about as respectable as any of the big boys. And what's rather interesting is that Tilly seems to take a like to her. Now, it's very highly suggested, it's not outright told that Tilly is also a lesbian, but it's very obvious the way that she just kind of makes loving glances at Pussy, which also has purple eyes. I mean, I hear that's a thing, but I can't say I've seen anybody with purple eyes, so that's pretty unique. So there's a bit of a passage here about Bond's thought on homosexuality, and I think I just better read it real quickly. Bond came to the conclusion that Tilly Masterton was one of those girls whose hormones had gotten mixed up. He knew the type well, and thought they and their male counterparts were a direct consequence of giving votes to women and sex equality. As a result of 50 years of emancipation, feminine qualities were dying out or being transferred to the males. Pansies of both sexes were everywhere, not yet completely homosexual, but confused, not knowing what they were. The result was a herd of unhappy sexual misfits, barren and full of frustrations. The women wanting to dominate, and the men to be nannied. He was sorry for them, but he had no time for them. Now, I get the idea that this book was written in a different time period, but I kind of take offense to this because, well, I'm a lesbian. And on top of that, I cannot only imagine what Ian Fleming's response to a transgender lesbian reading this book would be. But at the same time, while I do find it offensive, I continued reading. It was just really a small section that I honestly just couldn't get out of my mind. But to get back to the story, though, one of the things I like about my particular edition of the book, and maybe this is in other versions, is that while Goldfinger is explaining his plan to rob Fort Knox, there is actually a map on the page, so you can kind of follow along as he's saying he pointed here, pointed there. And most of that is thoroughly described on this page, so it is just perfect. Meeting is adjourned, and it seems like there are a few people that just do not want to go for it. They have an rather unfortunate accident on the way out, and had to leave in a hurry. Wink, wink. One of the interesting things about this plan is that when he was explaining it to the mob bosses, Goldfinger says that he was going to put a very powerful sleeping tablet inside the water supply. This would knock out the people for a good 2 days, and they'd wake up well rested. However, after the meeting, Bond looked into this formula to try to figure out how much of it should go in the water supply for that many people. To which Goldfinger confessed that it's actually a deadly poison, and all these people would be dead. Now, just like in the movie, there is a famous line here where Goldfinger shows he doesn't care anything for humanity, as the number of people he's going to kill is about as many as the American motorists kill every 2 years. It's weird, but somehow that line kind of resonates more in the book. It just kind of shows his low self-esteem for human life and not really caring who he hurts in the process. Now, through some miracle, Bond is able to get the word out of all this. However, it's not really revealed what happened one way or the other. So it seems like the plan is going as is. It seems like all of a sudden people are struck by an odd illness all around the area of Fort Knox. And Goldfinger, posing as relief nurses for a pandemic, is able to board a train and get to Fort Knox. Because the entire area has been quarantined, they basically have the whole area all to themselves. Now, the way they describe this in the book, I find rather scary how much I relate to. The idea that it just seems like life has completely gone to a standstill. That was basically what it was like going outside of the house after the first or second month of the quarantine. Everything was closed, everything was frozen in place, and you never found a single person on the road. All you would just hear is the wind every so often. I remember there was a few times I had to go into work to take care of a few things. Half the lights were on. And I was the only person in the building. The only sound you heard was just a faint whisper. And that is how it is very accurately described here when Goldfinger's group rolls in. However, there is an occasional sound. Crying babies. As the babies wouldn't have drinking water, but the fresh milk from the now dead mothers that are all over the place. So it seems like the plan is going on without a hitch, when all of a sudden there is a loud pop. And just like magic, everybody gets up from the dead and they start swarming in on Goldfinger. It turns out that Bond's message was received by Felix Leiter. So in the ruckus of all this back and forth firing, Bond sees his chance to run away with Tilly to safety. However, Tilly does not want to be saved by Bond. She wants to be saved by Pussy. So, she lets go of Bond and tries to run to Pussy. However, in doing so, Oddjobs takes aim and the deadly hat hits her square in the neck, right about there, killing her instantly. Maybe I'm just kind of reading too deep into this, but after that one quote about homosexuality, it just seems like she died because she was homosexual. If she was heterosexual, she would have made it. See, it was her love for other women that did it. Maybe that's just me reading too deep into it. Now here's what's interesting. While the gold is returned back to Fort Knox, several of the gang members, as well as Goldfinger, completely disappear. While he is definitely thanked on the United States side of things, having dinners with the president, meeting with various FBI officials and other various big wigs, he is still left very unsatisfied with how this case ended. With not much else to do, Felix takes Bond back to the airport in his rather odd mode of conveyance that was described in Diamonds Are Forever. A mixture of a Studebaker and a Cadillac. Basically, like, melted the bodies all into one to make some sort of super abomination. They reminisce for a while about old cases when they have to go their separate ways and Bond boards the plane to go to England. However, there is a problem as there is some sort of epidemic going on in one of his connecting flights, so he has to get a vaccine. I'm just laughing at the irony that I was in line for my second dose of the COVID vaccine when I was reading this section of the book. It was a very long line. What else was I going to do? So Bond begrudgingly rolls up his sleeve and they inject him. He takes a few steps and then passes out, having his face crash right to the floor. So when Bond wakes up, he sees that he is next to another passenger, who turns out to be Oddjobs. Goldfinger comes in and explains him the situation. After he talked to headquarters in Smersh, apparently they'd be very interested in an interview with him, as he has thwarted several of their plans, and they'd like to know how it was all possible that one man could take down a communist regime. So it's a bit of a long flight, and while Bond is being served some drinks, there is a cryptic message in there. Now, for some odd reason, Pussy Galore is also on the flight, and the message reads that she is with him. This bit of knowledge, he attempts to take over the plane. Now, how he does this is very interesting. Basically, he destroys one of the windows, and Oddjobs is immediately sucked right out into the abyss. And then in the scuffle, Bond and Goldfinger go at it hand to hand, just going crazy. And at the end of it, it just gets to both of them just wringing each other's necks. And it gets to a point where Bond is quite savage and just completely strangles Goldfinger to death. Now, I find that rather interesting because in the movie, Oddjobs was already dead at this point, and it was Goldfinger that got sucked out the window. But I can see why they did it this way, as they probably didn't want to have this charming, debonair guy just be like, "You're gonna get it!" Wouldn't have necessarily sold that image. Now, in terms of where I was in the vaccine, I just already had it, and this is the part where I was just kind of in the 15-minute recovery room, and it was just enough time to finish the book, actually. So at this point, Bond is able to take over the plane, gets to the intercom, and makes a landing strip out in the middle of the ocean. Obviously, the Coast Guard is really amazed to have such a high-profile person to be taken care of. So they just barely make it. They go for a water landing. However, Goldfinger's share of the gold, which he was running away with, is what inevitably sinks the plane down to the bottom of the sea. However, Bond and Pussy are able to make it just fine, and about 10 minutes later, the Coast Guard is able to pick them up. Now, this is one of the things I found a little bit baffling, is the ending here. So, it seems that Pussy is in a little bit of rough shape, and that she would need a massage. However, she is quite obstinate that Bond would be the one to administer this massage. So, when they ask for an explanation, I feel like I should just read it. Bond says, "They told me you only liked women." She said, "I never met a man before." Okay, I'm probably overselling it. I'll just read it in my normal voice. "I never met a man before." The toughness came back into her voice. "I came from the South. You know the definition of a virgin down there. Well, it's a girl who can run faster than her brother. In my case, I couldn't run as fast as my uncle. I was 12. That's not so good, James. You ought to have been able to guess that." So when I read that, I took that as the idea that because she was from the Deep South, she was very strong, very manly, and just seemed like she wasn't interested in guys. Because that was her lifestyle. She was brought up on the farm. She had to do a lot of running, a lot of heavy lifting. And manly features are often associated with lesbianism. However, I just recently saw a review of this book, and they offered a rather different interpretation. So, according to them, she confessed that the main reason she was a lesbian is because she was raped by her older uncle instead of one of her brothers. I get the idea it's the Deep South, but I would have never got that from this if it wasn't from that review. Leave your opinions in the comments. Is that something you would have gotten from reading that section I just did? Depending on your definition of how you read that, either she turned straight, or she just succumbed to his great handsomeness. And in true James Bond style, they make out. And that's the end of Goldfinger. So yeah, I loved this book. I would still put Moonraker slightly higher as there's no slow, boring golf section. This is a bit more action-packed. But if you can get past both the golf section as well as the rather insensitive nature against Koreans and homosexuals, then I think you'll find that this is just as good when the action really gets going. So if anybody were to ask me if I were to recommend the book or if I were to recommend the movie, in all honesty, I recommend both. They both have a very similar story, but both are just different enough to be completely different experiences. Not only is there a bit of explanation as to why the hat is so deadly, but also why Goldfinger is so obsessed with Koreans and why he paints these women gold. However, I'd have to say I'm a little more in favor of the book. Now, I guess really the main thing is when it comes to the movie, the last half, Bond is basically just in prison trying to escape, and it's just not working out. Here it feels like he has a little more control. I mean, sure, he's also in prison, but he's doing a lot of work. He's not just sitting there. He's getting all these paperwork, all these details straightened out, all these timetables for Operation Grand Slam, rather than just kind of sitting there and then waving at the guard and then disappearing and then knocking out said guard and then failing another escape attempt. However, I will definitely admit the finale of the movie might be a little better, if not just for the idea that you actually get to go inside Fort Knox. And also this idea that Fort Knox will be exploded, as well as with Bond, Odd Jobs, and Kish. So there's just like a three-way tie to get to the key, which then quickly becomes a two-way. But now I feel like I'm just reviewing the movie. So, Goldfinger, if you're reading all the other Bond books, good read. After that one was For Your Eyes Only, which is a collection of short stories. I already read that one. So the next one would be Thunderball. I just kind of wanted to show this particular one off because this is probably the best condition book I have. And, well, just because I like to go around with the books a lot, you can see that they get crumpled up a little bit. But here's the thing I find interesting. You'll notice that the pages yellowed with age. In this one, the pages are still white. It just kind of shows the great shape of it. I'm a few chapters in, and quite frankly, I'm not very impressed. I mean, we basically just kind of start with, I'm ordering Bond to go to this health clinic because that's the kick he's on now. And there he just coincidentally runs into somebody, part of the Tong gang. And then it's just kind of a bit of back and forth of trying to ruin each other's therapy sessions. It's just stupid. And then after that, we kind of get something rather interesting. So usually SMERSH was the evil organization that Bond was up against. This time we have the introduction of Spectre, as well as Ernst Stavro Blofeld. It's interesting that he's described with brown hair and a crew cut, even though in most of the iterations, Blofeld was always bald. But even then, the way they're just describing this in so painstakingly detail, you can just see what everybody is having for dinner, and then it gets to a point where Ernst is making his speech about his evil plan, and there's just all these specifics. I don't need to know what is happening on the 32nd latitude in 26 seconds. Just go on to the next thing. So yeah, maybe you'll look forward to my Thunderball review, but that should give you a small taste as to the idea of how I feel about it. Till next time, keep having fun.